This is Duke University.
Hi, I'm Nancy Armstrong. I'm happy to say I'm in the English department at Duke. And I'm very happy to introduce this roundtable, concluding a fabulous day of talks. Let me quickly introduce the people. I'm going to introduce all four of them sequentially, and then we can just move down the table. Stanley Fish is Davidson Kahn Distinguished University Professor of Humanities and Law at Florida International University. Prior to moving to FIU, he served as Dean of the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences at the University of Illinois at Chicago. He's also taught at UC Berkeley, Johns Hopkins, and here at Duke, where he was Arts and Sciences Professor of English and Professor of Law from 1986 to 1998. He served as Executive Director of Duke University Press, yay, from 1993 through 1998. In addition to over 200 other scholarly publications on law, literature, and the university, he's the author of 13 books. And I'm sparing you most of the titles. I do want to give you I do want to cite specifically his most recent, How to Write a Sentence, 2011. And I should also say that the Stanley Fish Reader, edited by H. Herrnstein, was published in 1999. He is also a regular op-ed columnist for the New York Times. You've probably seen him there. Tim Lenoir, Stanley's in the middle. Tim Lenoir is the Kimberly Jenkins Chair for New Technologies and Society at Duke University. He is the author of several books and articles on the history of biomedical science from the 19th century to the present, including Instituting Science, the Cultural Production of Scientific Disciplines, 1997. As a recipient of the MacArthur Foundation Digital Millennium Award, that sounded very important to me, so I'm not sure. There are many. I'm being very selective here. So, Lenoir recently completed work on virtual peace, http://www.virtualpeace.org, a multiplayer first-person simulation environment for students and humanitarian groups and workers in the field of peace and conflict resolution. He is currently working on Emergence, a new transmedia multiplayer game in the newly emerging field of alternate reality games. I thought that's what university was.
That's right, that's what we're able to do.
ARGs. ARGs. You will hear about this. Remember, ARGs, ARG. Foregrounding diplomacy and cooperation instead of violence and competition, set in a post-apocalyptic future and designed as an interactive ecology in which players help themselves by helping others. Susan Hegeman received her PhD in literature from Duke. That's why I mentioned your PhD, from Duke, in 1992, and is currently Associate Professor of English at the University of Florida. Her book, Patterns for America, Modernism, the Concept of Culture, Princeton, 1999, examines the joint modernist project of anthropologists and literary critics at the turn of the century to define and deploy the idea of culture. She's currently completing a book entitled The Cultural Return, which traces the history of the cultural turn of the 1980s and 90s to offer an account of culture's ascendancy as a central interdisciplinary concept and the reasons for its more recent failing fortunes. Rob Mitchell is Associate Professor of English at Duke. Professor Mitchell. Rob is interested in relations between literature, philosophy, and the sciences in the 18th century and Romantic era, as well as contemporary intersections between information technologies, genetics, and commerce. He has published 2 monographs, Sympathy and the State in the Romantic Era, System, State, Finance, and the Shadows of Futurity. That's in 27. And BioArt and the Vitality of Media, University of Washington Press, 2010. He's currently working on a monograph on the role of experimentation in Romantic era vitalist science and literature. Okay, Stanley, you're on.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here. I'm very pleased to be back at Duke. I'm very pleased to be in this building and to see it as evidence of the continuing vitality of the intellectual life of Duke in general. And I'm more than pleased to be here on this occasion to honor my very good and old friend, Barbara Herrnstein Smith. So I'll start off with a Barbara Herrnstein Smith anecdote from a conference we both attended at the University of Pennsylvania many years ago, and she was a faculty member there. She gave an elegant talk, as one might, of course, expect and predict, making some of the points that have been attributed to her by previous speakers today, and making them with a clarity that you all recognize. And then someone stood up and presented, as a counter-argument, a warmed-over version of everything that she had just critiqued, and finished his presentation with a flourish as, "And what do you make of that?" And she says, and I quote, "I thought that I had ground it into dust beneath my feet." Now, let me hasten to add that in fact, in her writing, is not Barbara's usual style, although it is a style which she can obviously employ and deploy at will and at the moment. In fact, her style, and here I'm going to continue some of the remarks on her style that Casper began with, her style is an extremely interesting part of her argument. And Nancy mentioned this new book of mine, How to Write a Sentence, which contains examples from many authors. The sentence that I'm about to read from Barbara's Scandalous Knowledge could easily have been one of the sentences that I presented for admiration and perhaps emulation. I'll just read it. "Thus the mind may be seen as a name given to a historically shifting set of heterogeneous phenomena and notions, ranging from introspective experiences and observable patterns of behavior to the various faculties, processes, and interior mechanisms that, at various times and in various formal and informal discourses, parentheses, philosophical, ethical, legal, medical, and so forth, end of parentheses, have been posited or assumed to explain them, period." Now, what I like about that sentence, and why I say that it tells us a lot about not only Barbara's writing style, but about the thought that she hopes and indeed can be said, hopes that that style accomplishes, is that a sentence like this explains why many of those who begin with positions that she then demolishes, or at least unpacks in a critical way, will never be able to hear her. And they will never be able to hear her, in part, because they will never be able to get through one of these sentences. They will never be able to get through one of these sentences because what they will be waiting for and expecting is a strong, finite assertion of something or other. And they're never gonna get it. And they will become impatient and walk away and then report some reductive version of what she was saying. And this happens over and over again. In other words, what the style is, in effect, is a succession of momentary assertions, each of which is in danger of asserting too much. And therefore, even as it is delivered, it is qualified, and not only by the assertions that follow, but by the serial qualifications performed by parentheses, italics, boldface, of the qualifying qualifications. The style then raises and answers the question of what the reader should or can take away from the experience of this prose. And the answer to that question is an overarching caution about the making of claims, and at the same time, an invitation to investigate and live for a while within a multiplicity of claims. That's what this sentence does, and that's what her work does, among, of course, many other things that have been described and justly praised today. The only other thing I want to do by way of my 7 minutes, I think, is to introduce a discourse that has not yet been mentioned today, but one that I think will be illustrative of many of the points that Barbara makes in her work, and that is the discourse of law. And I'm introducing the discourse of law because I know something about it, and I know very little about science, as those who read my New York Times columns, and especially my columns attacking the new atheists, are always reminding me, to which I respond, yes, I don't know very much about science, but I don't have to. You do have to know something about religion to make the remarks that you make, and you don't. But that's a whole other set of values. Now, the example that I have in mind is contract law. Contract, which is an amazing subject, contract law is, at least as we have it in the United States, is ideally a branch of law which imagines at its center two persons who have never encountered one another before and hold each other at arm's length while engaging in a transaction, or as the literature puts it, engaging in an exchange of considerations. This exchange is supposed to take place between autonomous beings who have no histories either with one another or in general, but who are equal, that is, who are equally without histories, and who are equal and have an equal have an equal capacity of choice, which is to be, above all, respected. The capacity of choice is to be respected, with no particular concern what the choice is made. That's why it's often said that it's not the business of the court to police the terms of contract, to decide whether it was a good contract, a wise contract, a reasonable contract. Rather, contract represents the meeting of minds between two autonomous persons. Now, this system of contract is very specific, although it presents itself as universal. And one of the ways in which it is specific is that its inability, which is a weak word, its absolute antipathy to the idea of a gift. Contract law hates the idea of a gift because a gift is gratuitous. That is, I give you something and I'm not asking for anything in return. What can you do with that? So contract law doesn't want to have anything to do with that kind of exchange, because if you begin with a gratuitous gift and then expand from that to an idea of persons involved, you're going to have to introduce notions of generosity, reciprocity, which is not economic necessarily, and perhaps the idea of gifts as the cornerstone of a society that exhibits a certain kind of fellow feeling, where certain kinds of fellow feeling are not allowed into the world of contract, which operates on a Hobbesian model. And in fact, Hobbes's discourse on contract grounds his entire politics. And he says quite correctly, if you begin with this idea of contract, you can build everything on it. But of course, everything turns out to be Hobbesian, not everything. Now, the nice thing about contract is that the textbooks, the case books, that then presented to law students, in their structure, undermine, point for point, the very basis that is supposedly informing the textbook. I don't know if any of you have seen contract textbooks, but they all begin with a very long section on offer and acceptance, which you might think was a simple matter, but of course it is not. And the ways in which offer and acceptance are complicated, and the difficulty of telling when one has or has not occurred become almost insuperable, especially when into the discussion is brought in this wonderful document, which some of you may have seen, called the Uniform Commercial Code, which is neither a code nor uniform. It's supposed to give you a recipe for dealing with transactions. And transactions are cataloged, and then you're told in a number like UC 207, is one I recall with affection, that this is, in this kind of a transaction, you do this. But then there are 4 pages of commentary, as if this were the Midrash or something. And by the end of that, and you go on to the next section. But the table of contents in the contract book tells you even more. After offer and acceptance, you get duress, mistake, and unconscionability. Those are 3 big chapters. That is, you get the acknowledgement of error, misapprehension, multiple understandings, multiple perspectives, all of which suggest that so-called ideal contract between 2 denatured individuals has never nor could ever occur. And that, in fact, if it did occur, if it was allowed to occur so that all notions of duress, mistake, unconscionability were left out, the results would be not only distorting of human experience, but absolutely destructive of human experience. So a contract, which should stand for the proposition, words mean exactly what they say. A man's word is his bond. Contracts are foundation. Doesn't survive the contract casebook, which is at the same time maintaining a foundational, formal, abstract, self-enclosed account of itself and unbuilding it every moment at the same time.
Yes.
Well, I'm also very delighted to be here to participate in this celebration of Barbara's work. And my comments are going to really just focus on a couple of things related to two of the last speakers we just heard. I was very struck by Casper's discussion of Barbara's work. And I, like Casper, first of all, came to Barbara's work through my somewhat entrenched involvement in the science wars, and was very much taken by her work. And and in particular, the thing that I want to point out is that, in contrast to some of I have a kind of like different take on some of her work than what I've heard being presented today. I know Barbara's really nice, and she likes everybody to have their say and give every argument its due chance. But I have a feeling that particularly Belief in Resistance, that book, is organized around a very almost kind of foundationalist argument. At least it was for me as a sort of card-carrying social constructivist. And so I came at this book from a slightly different position. I'd already been involved in developing case studies that illustrate the social construction of scientific knowledge. But the thing that really struck me about Barbara's approach is that she comes at it from the point of view of a kind of pragmatist, almost ecologist linguist. And so the fundamental thing is about how language works. And from that, then she builds on it. So I want to mention a couple of the things that she starts with that I think are just, for me, priceless. First of all, she looks at communication as basically what she thinks of. She calls it the language loop, and she thinks of communication as a kind of circuit of what she calls reciprocal effectivity. That is a dynamic process that works, has appropriate effects, but not the same effects for all those who are speakers and writers and so forth. So one of the things that I think comes from that, and where she goes with that, is to resist ideas that there are kind of standard idea that reference is something, that there are objects out in the world, and references is simply pointing to those objects, and that our statements are meaningful because they refer, or that our statements are made true because of conditions in the world. And so she basically breaks from that idea, which you might think of as a kind of Cartesian linguistics. She has actually no trouble whatsoever with Chomsky or other people who think that there are sort of innate structures of language. Fundamentally, for Barbara, it's basically a set of causally complex, interactive iterations of verbal behavior that works. And it works not because of reference, but because of the way that people communicate with one another. So those kinds of things I think are quite interesting. And from that, this sort of what she calls cognitively complex and reciprocal, she moves on from there to another whole framework, so from that she builds up the notion of how things work in terms of beliefs. And beliefs, she argues that, this is a quote from Barbara, the historical processes of testing and verifying beliefs, scientific and other, may be seen then not as the gradual shaping up of our more or less errant but malleable beliefs by the autonomously resistant features of fixed reality, but rather as the continuous, mutually shaping interactions between our more or less changing beliefs and the more or less changing worlds in which we operate with them. So she has this kind of view of sort of situated, that humans are kind of situated learners. We have a particular set of senses, and for us the reality is constructed in a certain way. If you want to talk about, to take the Millicew example, the idea that we can have a non-human sort of observation of reality just would not make any sense from this perspective. The idea that there's multiple versions of reality makes perfect sense. Every kind of cognitive niche has its own kind of version of the world, because the world is constructed in conjunction with our communicative interactions. It's not hardwired. It's not some sort of causal determination from the outside in. It's not some sort of thing like that. So from that, then it's just a straightforward step from that kind of position to think about science as social construction. And by that, it doesn't mean that science is made up, that language makes up reality, or that we kind of invent things and collude to conspire. But basically, our entire experience is built through these kind of communicative experiences, and so that whenever we're engaged in discourse, there's always a kind of technological component. We're always making, the world is something that we're making at the same time that we're making social connections and making the world around us. And so there are various kinds of layers of social, technical, and other forms of communicative experience. So for that makes perfect sense then to me why Fleck comes out to be such a key person for Barbara. She points out that the problem that concerned Fleck most centrally was not the classic question of what is knowledge, or how do we certify that we know something, but how does that which we call knowledge come into being? So it's always a question about how we understand the mechanisms of our social collective. So in contrast to the sort of philosophy of science that I learned as a graduate student, I was actually a student of Noretta Kurtke's. She was as hard-nosed as she seems to be today. And in that kind of philosophy of science, what we sought for a kind of logically proper formulation and empirical testing of hypotheses, trained observation, controlled experimentation, basically to remove the human, remove any kind of form of subjective interpretation from the construction and stabilization of facts. But in this new form that Fleck really introduces us to, and that Latour takes to another level, a very brilliant level, Fleck was not drawn to that kind of perspective. He was persuaded, as Barbara points out, that scientific observation is inevitably shaped by collective assumptions and ongoing social coordinations, just as our language is. It's always involved in social coordinations. And furthermore, that such shaping and coordination are inextricable elements of the process that yields scientific facts. So what I find just fascinating about Barbara's work is the way that she has, it's not just a question of opening up different forms of, being tolerant of other views, and let's just let everything ride. Rather, it seems to me that there's a very strong, almost a kind of behaviorist foundationalism at stake here, organizing a kind of a theory about how human communication takes place, that it's collective, that it is not organized around a kind of notion of externally existing reference, but actually our sensory processes are always engaged. She doesn't want to make a distinction between an inside and an outside. Our experience of the world just is connected that way. And that becomes in the basis of a very fascinating and way of looking at how actual scientific truth
Can you hear me? Well, first of all, I'm going to add my thanks to the organizers and all the presenters today. It's been a really wonderful day, and I'm just really honored to be here and to be able to celebrate with you all Barbara's remarkable career. Barbara reminded me yesterday that we came to Duke at the same time, 1987, and that I was probably her first dissertation student here. And that led me to think that maybe I ought to make some comments about my particular place in your history from my very different perspective as a graduate student at that time, a confused graduate student, as most of us are when we start out at the very least. But 1987, of course, was a really heady moment at Duke. A very politically charged environment where really many of us saw an academy that was directly engaging in some really exciting ways with public discourse, but also involved in something that we like grandly to call politics. I don't know. And so Barbara may be, as she puts it, a veteran of conflict. The rest of us, though, who were trying to sort of figure out where we stood in terms of what seemed like very contentious terrain, looked, of course, to Barbara, among many others, some of them gathered here, as models for how to engage with this terrain. And I was particularly grateful, again, to Casper's comments about Barbara's style, because her style was an important part of that modeling. A style that I think people have talked about very nicely over the course of the day as being, of course, intensely rigorous and engaged and sometimes scrappy and funny. And that was important to a lot of us to see and to have modeled for us, which I think is really what a mentor does. Now, the discussions today made me sort of think about then how that model of Barbara as someone who was engaging in a particular political moment, a particular scholarly moment, how that comes through in the work and in the conversations that we've had today. And I'm tempted actually to pick up on your description of her behaviorist foundation. I am tempted to deploy my own vocabulary, which goes to ethnology, and to say that there is a kind of ethnology of scholarship also at work in your work. That what we can see, and that a number of the people who are speaking today deduced in their various comments about your work, Barbara. It's one in which knowledge is a production of complex interactions of beliefs and human beings. As we heard today, there is room for radical disagreement, for even incommensurability, and I think that's a rather astonishing point. And yet there are certain things that are obviously off limits in a sense, in that there are certain rules that make this encounter impossible. And those are things that must be scrupulously challenged. And so we talked today a number of times about the argumentative gestures, the reductionism, the foreclosure of debate, the forestalling of the encounter. That is finally the thing that is off limits for you. I'm tempted. I mean, I believe Mark referred to this as a kind of ethics of scholarship, and I agree that it is, but I'm also tempted to suggest that there's a politics implicit here as well. And maybe I can refer to Fred Jameson's comments at the opening about the kind of academic tea party that resists theory, if we were to use that word again, but also that resists certain kinds of gestures, including, of course, relativism famously, and a few more. Really the politics here is keeping open the conversation in the face of certain kinds of antagonism. And I'll suggest that there's also an institutional politics here, which I would associate with interdisciplinarity. So a number of us, I'm sure, in this room have benefited from Barbara's participation in the production and maintenance of interdisciplinary sites, and that seems to me very much of a piece with the kinds of ethical gestures and perhaps political gestures that are also in evidence in her work. That concludes my thoughts. Thank you. Rob, you're up.
Okay. Well, I too will add my thanks for being asked to give this response. And I also wanted to note that one of the interesting and exciting things, and I won't say necessarily unanticipated, but nevertheless surprising in a nice way, is how much I've learned about Barbara's work at this event. And I say slightly surprising because I feel like this is work that I know well. But I think kudos to the event organizers for bringing people together from a number of different perspectives, because I've heard things about her work that I think are right, and I had not considered it in precisely that light. So that's been exciting for me. I don't know if I can add to that, but to those new perspectives. But in any case, that's my experience. And so our charge here, as members of the concluding roundtable, was, if possible, to focus on just one key issue or problem or argument that we see as central to Barbara's work. And this, I think, is an entirely reasonable request that Nancy made of us, especially given that our contributions are coming at the end of a very stimulating day of discussion, which is a way of saying that at a point in the day and in the end when our brains may be full. At the same time, as I looked at the rather lengthy book that make up the Barbara Herrnstein Smith part of my library, as I thought back on the many conversations that Barbara and I have had in what is now almost a decade, almost a decade of being here at Duke, I found it hard, in fact, to isolate just one issue, problem, or argument. And I think this difficulty is in part due to my own paratactic tendencies, that is my desire to make series rather than to subordinate one element to another. But I think my difficulty was also a consequence of the fact that Barbara's work functions, in general, not by parsing the world through a key issue or problem or argument, for example, a certain theory of causality or lack thereof, but rather by creating networks that bring multiple elements of the world into relationship and conversation with one another. Whether these elements be poetry and Gestalt psychology, as in the case of her first book, or religion and evolutionary science, as in the case of her most recent book. So with that said, I'll nevertheless try to honor the spirit and letter of the invitation to speak at this roundtable by identifying at least one lesson that is, for me at least, central to Barbara's work, and which I think we cannot hear repeated too often. It's actually a quite simple lesson, and I'll put it in the form of a factual statement. Namely, science does not speak with a unified voice. Science, in fact, is not a unity at all, but rather a series of different communities engaged in vociferous and sustained judgment and debate. Or to draw on the complex, felicitous term, science is a series of thought collectives, or maybe not even a series, but a swarm and a heterogeneous swarm at that. Each of these thought collectives is itself divided in its opinions, each is always in transition, and each is always in search of allies, to draw their Lenoir's terminology. So, in other words, we shouldn't look at science as though it were a monolith, but rather we ought to see one great, looming, buzzing confusion in the most positive sense of that phrase. Recognizing this internal division, but also dynamism of the sciences is, I think, absolutely essential if we want to understand how, in fact, the sciences operate. And I think it's also central to Barbara's vision of how humanists ought to relate to the sciences. Unfortunately, this internal division of the sciences is often either missed entirely by humanists, or, if it is recognized, misinterpreted. Humanists who simply do not see the internal division of the sciences arguably commit the more problematic and consequential of these two forms of errancy, where they end up treating science not as the swarm of thought collectives that I suggest that it is, but rather as something much more like a bank. That is a repository of valuable facts that can be withdrawn and then invested for profit in the humanities by simply using the phrase, scientists have established that, and then you can fill in the blank with whatever you want, whether it's about evolutionary adaptive mental inference systems or something else. It generally turns out, of course, that the branch of this bank from which literary critics have drawn their facts is a journalistic account of a scientific development or a book written for lay people by a scientist who has a particular position he or she is seeking to advance within as well as outside his or her field. We can and we ought to consult such sources, but we ought not to think that a given article, given book contains the results of science. In the other form of errancy, humanists, and it's actually more often those in social sciences, such as historians or sociologists, do recognize the internal ascension of the hard sciences. But they misinterpret the ascension by seeing in it only an opportunity for a critique of science. Critiquing science generally means showing that the sciences are as driven by political forces, economic interests, racial inequities, and gender divides as the rest of society. The affective force of such critique depends upon a logic of profanity, of humbling that which formerly seemed sacred. And in an era in which the sciences do often seem to receive more respect, money, and prestige than the humanities, such acts of sacrilege will reliably bring all the pleasures and rewards of iconoclasm. But they tend, by that very token, to prop up the icons that they purportedly seek to dismantle. And this, I think, was the point that Casper was making in a more elegant way. As Barbara's work shows again and again, though, the felt need for such sacrilege tends to disappear when the plurality of science is recognized. What then becomes possible, and I think each of Barbara's books is testimony to this possibility, is an intellectual discussion between particular humanists and particular scientists, rather than a discussion about science by humanists or a critique of science by humanists. Such a discussion between particular humanists and particular scientists can then proceed, as in all of Barbara's books, on the basis of a willingness to take the other party seriously. And this is, as again Barbara's books prove, a freeing gesture. It is freeing in the sense that we can make judgments about particular branches of research. For example, we can note, along with Barbara, that there are a number of styles of evolutionary psychology, and this is a number of styles, not all of evolutionary psychology, that seem not to admit any empirical proof or disproof. You can judge that fact. But we are also free to make connections we are also free to make responsible connections with styles and branches of the sciences that help us to open up new approaches in and new questions for our own work. Barbara's work, in short, proves that by acknowledging that science is not a unitary voice, but rather a swarm of thought collectives, we are able to, and we should, think harder than we might have done otherwise.
I'd like to take a stab at some poetic closure before we turn over the proceedings to Barbara. This is sort of a companion piece to Stanley's description of her prose. I'm very fond of the wicked Barbara, the witty Barbara, the aphoristic Barbara. And I've chosen two of many. These are among my favorite moments in Scandalous Knowledge, where she boldly and clearly states the impossibility or the perils of making bold and statements. The first one reminds me a little bit of Oscar Wilde. If skepticism is the skeleton in rationalism's closet, relativism is the bugbear under its bed. And this, I think of as being more sort of Gertrude Stein. If relativism means anything at all, it means a great many things. That's it.
Yeah, we've got some time for some.
Okay. Oh, and then Barbara. After.
We have time for us to discuss, and then as that concludes, then.
Okay. Oh, sorry. I was trying to end it.
Yeah, I wanted to respond to a couple of things that were said, mostly by Susan. First of all, I'm always in a situation where I wish I had the authority to ban words and phrases. When I was the director of the press, I tried to institute a rule which said no book that included the word implicate could be published by the Duke University Press. I failed. Now I would like to say, in discussions like this, be very careful before you use the word politics, or at least precisely indicate what might be meant by politics. If there is a politics to Barbara's position, its status in my mind would immediately be diminished. I don't think, I hope not, I hope that there is no politics in the only sense in which politics makes any sense, that is, in partisan activity, which you are trying to persuade people to certain courses of policy action. So let's not talk about the politics of scholarship, because all it does is encourage a sloppiness which we will then indulge in, and which our enemies, who are legion, will attack, and moneyed, will attack us. The second thing I wanted to say is that it was in response to the phrase ethnology of scholarship. And I wondered if what Barbara is doing, or what others who are alive with her in various ways are doing, is an ethnology of scholarship. This is a question, I think, for Barbara too, is whether that ethnology is descriptive or prescriptive. If the politics, I now violate my own rule, if the politics of this kind of way of thinking is keeping open conversation, is keeping open the conversation a program? I don't think so. I don't think there can be any program keeping open the conversation. You don't get up in the morning, say to yourself, hey, today I think I'll keep the conversation. You get up and want to engage in the conversation because you think some people have gotten it wrong, or even worse, no one has yet seen how right you've gotten it. And so that you enter in to the conversation. Interdisciplinarity is a project that emerges, I think, in the context of trying to do specific tasks of work. I said this years ago, but I'll say it again because, well, Richard Rorty once said to me, I hope my friends tell me when I start writing the same article over and over again. I didn't say to Richard, it's too late. And one of the reasons I didn't say it to him is because I would have then had to have said it of myself. Because if any of us in this game have a half an idea or an idea, to run with throughout our entire careers, we're extremely lucky. And the fact that we then elaborate that idea, refine it, take back parts of it, give new parts to it, and so forth, is what we do. I don't think we ever do interdisciplinarity as a project or an agenda, which leads me then finally to a question which I put to Barbara, which might seem unrelated to what I've said, but I'm sure she will see the relationship immediately. Why, if you did, you give up literary courses?
Produced by Duke University. Online at duke.edu.